Welcome to J Life with Daniel. I am your host, Rabbi Daniel Levine. So, one of the most influential ideas that I think I've ever come across that certainly dictates how I live, or at least in theory, hope to live my life day by day, is Daniel Kahneman's idea of the active self versus the remembering self. And he sort of lays this out in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow. Highly recommend it for all listeners if you are sitting there at home. But in it, he essentially says that there's sort of two different types of memory and conceptions of the self. One is the present memory, where if you ask somebody how they're doing minute to minute, or even if you're scrolling on Instagram and you ask somebody, hey, are you happy that you are scrolling on Instagram for these 5 minutes? People will say, yeah, yeah, yeah. And then there's what he calls the remembering self, which is a week later, a month later, a year later, or even, 10, 20 years later, is somebody going to be happy they did that, right? So you could think, going to the gym or running a mile, generally by the time you're at the end of that mile, it sucks. But if you ask a couple hours later, hey, are you happy you ran that mile? Oftentimes the answer is very different than if you ask somebody, are you happy that you spent a week ago, Sunday afternoon, scrolling on Instagram? So I bring that all up because my guest today, Jonah Sanderson, explicitly works with people that are developing ethical wills at the end of their life. And we're going to, talk about all of these big picture ideas, but I thought I'd start with that anecdote. So Jonah, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Levine. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, so let's start there. I mean, I know this sort of sounds cliche, and but all good books about how to actualize your full potential, I think a lot of times start off with people talking about, end of life. There's been some fascinating studies. It was actually a book. I don't know if you've come across this. There was a book published at Harvard. They have the longest ongoing study of happiness. I think it's been about 120 years. Somebody could fact check me on that, where they've been doing this longitudinal study. So asking people, starting from 18, then again at 30, then again at 40, and then, all the way till, however long they make it, are you happy? And then taking in a bunch of benchmarks to figure out what actually makes people live a fulfilled life. But you're there sort of at the later stage. So, I mean, what wisdom have you gleaned on the most, basic level? And then we can tease it out.
Sure. So I think, first of all, love your podcast, very big fan. And I think that we're living in a time where meaning and happiness have to be parsed out. You and I both went to seminary for rabbinical and chaplaincy studies, and we learned how to parse Hebrew grammar. And just like we have to parse Hebrew words, we need to parse out words, the meaning of words within our own vernacular in the West. And I think America has gotten one thing very, 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 very wrong, which is the American dream is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But in my estimation, and in the estimation of many that are doing this work, it should be life, liberty, and the pursuit of meaning. And meaning is going to equal moments of happiness. And so when people are at the end of their life and they are unpacking their traumas, their challenges, their joys, and their all of that meaning, it really is beautiful to work with these people, because what you get to understand is that nothing really matters, and that people don't regret what they did. They regret what they didn't do.
Yeah, I really think that's interesting. So just to harp on, the parsing of Hebrew grammar, I mean, one of the interesting things specifically with the word happiness is the prefix hap, HAP, generally actually is not something positive, right? So we say haphazard, happenstance, hapless, right? All of those things, right? It almost comes with the implication of a tinge of randomness, right? This is just something that happens to you, right? And so happiness, I think in the West is very much this is something that, some people are lucky to have, other people aren't. And it almost creates this weird paradox. And I want to dig into this a little bit, because searching for happiness is almost certainly not going to give you happiness, right? It's almost like one of those illusions where you can actually only reach happiness if you set yourself on something bigger, and then happiness is almost sort of a byproduct, right? I actually have started thinking about love in the same way. I don't know, how far off, on a tangent we want to go, but it's one of those, ideas that I think is so elusive, right? Perhaps we could even connect this to a Jewish philosophy, even think about God the same way, but if something that is so intangible, elusive, and important, such as happiness, right? Because I don't think either of us would say happiness is not a goal. But if you direct all of your sights towards happiness and you keep on thinking about it, it almost becomes impossible because you're just so endlessly on the search that you're not experiencing the, I don't know, the journey, right? These are like all the classic cliches, but right, like the journey really is the whole thing, right? In other words, we often spend our lives, and I love you to weigh in on this, but we're both fairly in the beginning of our career. I talk to most people who are on college campuses or in undergrad and grad school, and it almost seems from some perspective, life becomes ticking off a bunch of things. So you got to graduate college, and then you got to get a job, and then you got to go finish grad school, and then you got to, meet somebody and, hopefully get married, and, like all of those different things. But then everybody always has the, okay, well, then I'll be happy at this stage and that stage, or when I acquire, X amount of net worth. And then at some point, the process is lost because you always view it as a journey instead of just appreciating, whatever stage of the journey you're on right now, like that's it. And that sounds negative in some way, but I think it's actually empowering.
So I think one, that the Talmud, our wisdom literature, talks about, do you want a long short road or a short long road? And the answer is a little bit of both, because Jews were our expressions are, it's everything's a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And so, I was just in Asheville, North Carolina for my best friend's engagement, and it reminded me of Portland, Oregon. And Portland's changed over the last number of years because the level of homelessness that has plagued that state has really, and the city has really plagued our country. And that's another discussion, which is, are people, a lot of these young people that are there in Asheville on the streets and in Portland in the streets, are very young. They're our age, in their 30s, maybe even their 20s. And the question that I have always asked, and even sometimes them, is, you look happy. Are you happy doing this? And some will say, yeah, they are. But do you find meaning in this? No, there's no meaning in this, because happiness of that kind becomes an addiction. And and when you search for meaning, your life is going to be a little bit more gray. But what I've always talked about with patients, and I'm in the first 3 years of this career, life is gray. It is not black and white. That is not only biblical, but it is a secular way of understanding it as well. And I think that when it comes time to talk about somebody's eventual passing, one of the things that I've always highlighted is, what did you do with your life that you wanted to pass on to your offspring? It's not about the house, the car, the money, the collections of a collection of all of that. It's about, what did you do? What did you teach your children, son, daughter, children, that matter? And what do you want them to know about how you lived your life? And so then when you unpack that, it's always about, I read this quote from a book 30 years ago that really resonated with me. Because of that quote from a book, I chose my wife that way, or my partner that way. And or I really loved golfing, but I didn't love just the sport. I loved being out in nature. And I was really took my kids to Yosemite for 20 years on family reunions, and we really bonded that way. And so I think a lot of that is where we are heading, especially because seniors and other people are living longer. They're needing, and they have more time to find that meaning in their lives.
Yeah, I love the Yosemite anecdote. This is something that, anyone who's friends with me, in personal life is going to, be tired of me saying this, because this is my sort of go-to whenever I'm trying to convince people to do something. I'm very much a, doer. I always want to be doing something. And, oftentimes there's a lot of friction or inertia that's required to start a process, right? So driving to Yosemite, right? I'm in Irvine, right? It'll take 7 hours to drive to Yosemite or whatever in rush hour traffic. And so, any given weekend, if I have 2 or 3 days, it seems like such a schlep to, load the car, right? Now I have a dog and a baby, right? I haven't actually taken her to Yosemite yet, but, I can imagine this summer, me getting into this mindset of, okay, is it really worth the 2 hours of prep, the 7 hours of driving, maybe we'll be there for a day or two, and then all the driving back, right? Like in real time, if we narrow in on that, at any given minute, it would be better, like, I'll just go for a small, short walk here in Irvine and then spend the rest of my time catching up on work. That might seem minute to minute better. But in 5 years from now, if I'm looking back, how did I spend that first summer of my daughter's life? I'm not going to remember the sitting in rush hour on the 405, cursing why I decided to leave Irvine at 4 p.m. to get to Yosemite. I'm going to remember, even if it's only 1 hour long hike that we do, I'm going to remember that. And even, just for people listening to this, you can even perform a little thought experiment on yourself. Think back to some of your best memories and vacations and trips and, times that you committed to do something. I don't even remember, I don't remember any flights, that I've ever gone on, maybe, okay, one or two if they've been, extra interesting. And I sat next to, I one time on a flight from LA to Tel Aviv, which is a 16-hour flight or something. I sat next to a journalist. So we talked the entire time. So that I remember. But aside from that, right, like I don't remember the, annoying hour of getting in traffic and waiting at the airport for 2 hours and boarding, like, in my memory, I have some sort of generalized memory of what that's like. But, what I do remember from every time I, said, okay, it's actually worth it to do this thing is great memories. But it's a lot easier to look at that retrospectively than actually have that change the way that you act now and in the future. Before there was sort of one other theme that I wanted to tease out, but I'm just kind of curious in that vein. I mean, what are some of the most common? I mean, I'm going to guess some of these are cliche, but you're obviously talking to people in, towards the end of their life, also some people explicitly, in hospice care at the end of their life. I mean, what are the things that you hear that they would have wished, you would have told them when they were, I don't know, 25?
So it's interesting. I just had this discussion. A lot of what I say comes from a teacher of mine, and I'm sure you know him, Rabbi Steve Leader of Wilshire Boulevard Temple, because he's a grief expert and writes on this. And I take a lot of his teachings and I just tell people, I give them out to audiences where even Steve wouldn't go. And my work is entirely with non-Jews. That's number one. And number two, Steve has a great quote, and I don't even know if it's his, but I want to attribute it to him because that's where we heard it. And that is, if you're going to go through hell, don't come out empty handed. And then the follow up to that is tend the part of the garden you can reach. And I think the challenge, Daniel, is that we're so focused, especially Gen Z and millennials today in this country, on fixing the problems that are around us, and we don't start from here. And so a lot of people have talked to me about wishing that they would have done that, would have started from within, because they don't have great relationships with their mother, their father, their brother, their sister, husband, wife, right? Co-workers. But they had spent 20 years fighting AIDS in Africa, or they had spent 20 years, talking about problems in the Middle East. And the challenge that we have is those problems will always exist. We can't cure anti-Semitism. We can't, cure the AIDS epidemic. We're getting a lot better with it, thank God, but we can't do it all in one foul swoop. But what we can do is generally the people that always focus outwards have a lot of inner turmoil. I will never forget this because it was just one of those examples. I was, a number of years ago outside in a group of young professional Jews at a thing, and I stepped on a bee that was gonna like buzz around me, and the person next to me freaked out. She was so upset, and she went on about the extinction of bees, and I just thought to myself, I wonder how you treat your mother, your father, because you're getting worked up over something that is very minuscule, and you seem like a very emotionally unhinged person. How do you treat those around you
I'm
and
sure she
yourself?
loved that. I'm sure she had a moment of oh, thank you so much, Jonah.
Right.
You're
He
totally
didn't.
right. I'm
He
sure.
did.
No, no, no. No, but I think, so I think I somewhat agree with what you're saying. I think the one element that I think many people would think in response is, okay, well then, because you obviously, to live a life worth living, you should be passionate about something. I mean, for me, it's not bees. For me, it is, Jewish education, Jewish history, trying to figure out anti-Semitism. I've sort of, maybe given up on that one in terms of curing it, but right, and so that obviously can't be a waste of time necessarily, but I think you can't get so caught up in that obviously you lose sight on what's truly important. I mean, the irony of something being so important as to being fundamental is oftentimes you don't even realize you're doing it, right? So, you don't realize when you breathe, but if you stop breathing, you'd learn very quickly that you're not breathing. And I think, oftentimes I think relationships are sort of similar where a lot of people will go on autopilot of, whatever, I've acquired, either this life partner or these friends or whatever, and then you kind of autopilot that and spend all your effort on sort of other things. And then you look back, 5, 10 years later, and your connection with your friends has, dwindled and all these things. I mean, that I think is a serious problem. And I think, especially because now with all the switches in technology and social media and everything like that, in the minute to minute, sort of Daniel Kahneman's, experiential self, there's almost no need to reflect because if you're constantly, refreshing your phone, you don't really have to think, how have my last 5 years been? Because you're always, just in the here and now. I think one of the things that I wanted to bring up when I was thinking about this topic was, you had in the 20th century, you had these competing versions of dystopia, through literature. So obviously, I think everybody here has read 1984, right? 1984, what it was written sometime in the mid 21st century. And, I'm sure listeners are familiar, but right, like that's a dystopian through, government authoritarianism, right? So either that's, anti-communist or anti, extreme fascism, they sort of become the same at some point. But there's another, I think, more interesting version of utopia in the 1930s, and that's Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. And that depicts a future where the dystopia is not because things are getting so bad that there's totalitarian government control. It's actually the opposite, right? It's the government has developed or somebody's developed some sort of drug that just makes everybody in pure 100% happiness bliss all the time. And then one person sort of, I don't want to spoil it, but going and sort of breaking out of that. I think it leads to a very interesting philosophic question, which is, and I oftentimes, like thinking about this also, but right, like someone offers you that pill, do you take it? Because that gets you very close to these people you were talking about on the streets in Portland. And from some perspective, I think it's a misalignment of empathy to just say, well, they're living their full choice and this is what they really want to be doing out on the streets. So we shouldn't, we shouldn't try to get them help. But I don't know. How are you thinking about this from your purview?
So I think that, I was going to go another way if I can with you with your podcast, so you push back. But I think that we need to speak about a broader topic within not just Jewish or the theological major religions, but within politics, within dialogue in general, which is proactive versus reactive. And I think I can speak from just a Jewish perspective to say that a lot of what we're seeing in Israel since the 7th is all about reaction for the most part versus proactivity. If we look and we say, what could we Jews have done that were living in Israel prior to the 7th terrorist attacks to stave them off or to not even have them at all, halavai, the question could be answered in that we needed to listen more than we acted. If the female spotters were taken seriously in the IDF instead of threatened with their jobs, because they were talking about what Hamas was going to do before they were doing it for more than 2 years, right? So we were not as proactive when we were reactive. And here in this country on anti-Semitism, it's great you're talking now a little bit about what your thoughts are on giving up, not working on it, but curing it, because you can't cure it. And in my estimation, the challenge is we have mission creep. And mission creep, for your listeners that might not know, is, in my opinion, when several organizations are doing the same thing and they're competing for the same funds and donors with very little end result. And it used to be that the ADL and the Wiesenthal Center in Los Angeles and across the country were doing anti-Semitism. Now, every federation, every JCC, every Hillel, they're all doing it. And that's got to stop, because it is not the job of a Hillel or a federation or a JCC to fight anti-Semitism. We have to bring joy back to religion, whether that's Judaism or Christianity or any other faith. It has to be meaningful to people. And when I meet people when they're about to pass away, one of the things that they do is they re-embrace their religion from childhood. And I've talked to them about a God of radical amazement and radical kinship. And that is not a Jewish or a Christian belief that is of old. That's a new theology in the 20th and 21st century. That's a new theology. And what I found is that when you take the old theology and you kind of make it new and exciting, people come back. Because we as Jewish leaders have seen a swath of people come back since the terrorist attacks of the 7th. But I've said, and I'm sure you agree, that if the only reason they're coming back is because of anti-Semitism, then they missed everything. And we have missed such an opportunity to give them what is really at the core of a Jew, which is Shabbos and Tefillin and kosher and Torah and learning and Gemara. All of those things equal the Jewish religion in Israel and food. But if we continue to say, well, we're only coming at it through these couple of lenses, then we are seeing what we're seeing in the North American Jewish community, which is a vacuum of leaders and a vacuum of rabbis where we don't have enough and we don't have good ones. And so the proactive piece isn't only at the end of your life, it's about throughout your life. Because the last thing I'll say is the other maxim that America has gotten, I think, severely wrong is it takes a village to raise a child. There's that expression. That is full of nothingness, because it should be it takes a village to raise an entire adult, because you're not done until you're done. So you're proactive from the time that you can be until the time that you take your last breath. That's my opinion.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. There's a lot of good tangents. It's good because usually I'm the one who pulls off random tangents, and then the guest is like, "Wait, how did we get here?" But no, this is good. I think let's just talk about the anti-Semitism piece, because I think I have sort of watched as my job has morphed into talking about anti-Semitism a lot more than I had planned. It's not, it's not one of those cases of I didn't sign up for this. Actually, my least favorite thing that I heard from Jewish professionals after October 7th was I didn't sign up for this, because I think if you're signing up to be a, leader in the Jewish community, you have to understand that that might include a rampant uptick in anti-Semitism due to some sort of pogrom-like attack. If you know anything about history, that's a separate thing on the side. I do agree that I think, wrapping anti-Semitism into the everyday Jewish life is not helpful, but I think I'm going to be a little bit more critical. I did a podcast with a good friend of mine, Andrew Gatrayer, who has been a long time, Hillel director for 30 years, and we spent about an hour and a half talking about this. So, if listeners, already heard that, I apologize, but I think anti-Semitism is just a lot easier for a lot of Jewish professionals to wrap their head around than studying Talmud. And so I think that a lot of times a focus on anti-Semitism tends to be a little bit of a cop-out. Obviously, there are times where it's important to talk about anti-Semitism. If I'm going to be slightly more controversial, I think, there's a similar complex happening, I think, with the way that we do Holocaust education, right? So this is obviously not saying we shouldn't have Holocaust educational events, but we don't need every synagogue having Holocaust memorial stuff 4 times a year, right? That's just not, that's never really been a Jewish idea, right? In Judaism, there was always Tisha B'Av, right? It's one day in the summer, you commemorate all national tragedies, even, and people might find this historic debate interesting, when Israel was considering having a Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day, most of the Orthodox rabbis were actually against the having of a separate day for Yom HaShoah, because they said, hey, we already have this day, Tisha B'Av. If Judaism would have had a separate commemorative event for every tragedy that has happened to us, okay, so then we'd have one about the Alhambra decree, and then the Khmelnytsky massacres, and then, what about the Farhud, right? It's like, you start to look, and then 200 out of 365 days are going to be, days of mourning. And so I think Judaism very smartly said, okay, and I think this is also, a good way to contextualize life in general, okay, we're going to have all of these, sorry days be, wrapped up into one. But I think instead, because oftentimes, I mean, again, I still feel this tension, because still, I know you can fill a room for whatever reason. You can fill a room of people, whether they're college students or adults, if you have somebody that's going to talk for an hour about anti-Semitism on campus, or about the Holocaust, or about something like that. If I were to say, a priori, hey, I'm going to come to your synagogue and I'll talk for an hour about Sajagon after, most of the people looking up who the heck is Sajagon, you'll have probably very few people attend, but I would surmise that at the end of a class or at the end, I just finished teaching my medieval Jewish philosophy class at UCI and, I'm looking through the evaluations and so many students said, in the beginning, I had no idea what to expect. And I sort of took this class because it fit my, my timeline. And, nobody comes to college wanting to learn about medieval Jewish philosophy at UC Irvine. I can promise you that. A lot of people said, this was just a really interesting journey into something I knew nothing about. That's where I think Jewish education really has to come in. But I think instead, we're sort of going for the low hanging fruit, which is I can talk for an hour about campus anti-Semitism. At this point, I can do it asleep. Versus the other stuff, which becomes more engaging. But I think, that gets back to this, I think, paradox of, are you doing something that's now and convenient and easy, or are you, planning for the long-term future? So I mostly agree with you. I do think because of necessity over the last year, there obviously has been a lot of mission creep. I think also, if I'm going to speak very candidly, which I've never not done at this point, a lot of it also has to do with donor alignment in Jewish organizations, right? Just like it's easier to fill a room saying, I'm going to talk about campus anti-Semitism for an hour than Sajagon for an hour. It's also a lot easier to fill an organization's bank account if you say, donate money so we can fix college anti-Semitism versus donate money so we can teach the next generation of Jews who, Judah Halevi is. So a lot of thoughts there. I don't know if that directly addressed what you were talking about.
I think that you're completely right. I think that, again, candidly, because these podcasts are often fun when we get off script and when we go into those candid moments, I'll go a step further. There are a lot of rabbis that shouldn't be rabbis today. The rabbinical schools are desperate for people. For the most part, they're taking people that have such a social justice alignment that they are it's convoluted to say, okay, so we're gonna talk about social justice and everything is going to go from that lens. And those people would make great politicians and great lawyers, but not great rabbis. The challenge is when you ask people, Jewish professionals, and even a random Jew on the street, what tikkun olam means, they don't know what it means. They don't know that it means l'teken olam, the malchut shaddai, from the Aleinu prayer we say 3 times a day if we are davening Jews. What they think is Habitat for Humanity and AIDS in Africa and the Mexican drug cartels. That's tikkun olam if I do it. No, it's actually not at all tikkun olam, because you have to know where it comes from, where it originates from, in order to actually connect it to Judaism. We don't own that word. We own the Hebrew, and we don't do it well. And so when I talk to people that are becoming rabbis and they say, I am going to, and I've heard this before, my dear friend is the Chabad Shliach at Oberlin. And, a couple of women came to him on the college campus and they said, please give us matzah for our anti-Zionist Passover Seder. And it should be an oxymoron. It should be chickens for KFC, queers for Gaza, right? Free the Palestine community. It's the same thing. It's all ridiculous nonsense and it means nothing. But my friend did say something which Chabad does so well. He said, I'm giving them the matzah. I gave them the matzah because what we can't do is shut out the dialogue. And I think too many people are shutting out dialogue and they're only interested in what they have to say and who they have to say it to. And that's the challenge with social media. That's the challenge with the rooms that we're in. We have always spoken to either the wrong people about the wrong thing or to the right people about the wrong thing.
Yeah, Chabad is very good at, just thinking about that anecdote, I think it's almost the opposite of what you see in a lot of, this is going to be funny, talking about Chabad this way, but a lot of groups that have this, ideological purity litmus test, Chabad actually sort of rejects that, right? Chabad, obviously they have their ideology that they believe in very strongly, but to actually get a seat at the table, you basically don't have to agree with any of it aside from, if you're willing to do this thing like eat matzah, it doesn't make a difference if you're doing it as a atheist or anti-Zionist or you think A, B, and C. All that matters is you're Jewish. And that's so different than I think oftentimes today, where we do want 100%, ideological purity commitment to the same thing before I even invite you to the table. So I actually love that anecdote. There were all sorts of funny pictures and memes of anti-Zionist Jewish students having tefillin wrapped on them by Chabad rabbis, all throughout the encampments last year. Obviously, I do need to say, because I'm actually preparing a podcast on this right now, it is still such a minority of young Jews that are, anti-Zionist, despite what you might read in, whatever, news magazine that want to make it seem like this, cosmic battle within Jewish organizations. But that said, the 5 or 10% of young Jews that are anti-Zionist, I think certainly, it doesn't make sense to, just shun them and reject them. But yeah, but I do think, again, Chabad and I think a lot of successful organizations sort of have more of a long-term vision than, again, there is sort of a problem with, or I'll put it this way. I think the move for a lot of synagogues and even a lot of young rabbinic students to be focusing most of their efforts on politics as opposed to actually Judaism is because politics is also one of those things that is interesting in the present, but very uninteresting in the long run. In other words, if I wake up every day and I am up to date with the latest hubbub happening with Trump or in Congress or whatever's going on, any given day you ask me, hey, are you interested that you read 3 articles and listened to the New York Times podcast on that? I'll be like, yeah, super interesting to hear about the potential government shutdown in Congress. If you ask me 10 years ago what I remember from, 10 years ago when I used to do that, the answer is almost zero. Versus if 10 years ago I decided, which I did, hey, I want to actually read the entirety of, I don't know, Plato's Republic. And it sucked, right? Every day, okay, you're going to read 5 pages, regardless of how much it sucks. Very few days was I looking forward to that. Now, 10 years forward, I'm very happy I read that. And it's actually changed the way that I think in my life in a lot different ways. And I think a lot of Jewish organizations fall into that same trap, which is, you give a sermon and it's all about, the latest politics. That is more interest in the present in a way that, will get people more, their gut will be like, oh, this is interesting. This is timely and relevant. But I think after years, the question is, well, what have you actually been building, right? It takes a long time to build a house, and a lot of times it doesn't look as sexy as, again, it's brick by brick and you're slowly doing it, and each step might be non-glamorous, but I think, the holistic picture, obviously, to quote another famous psychologist, right? This is the Gestalt school, right? The whole is greater than the sum of its parts, which I think, is really something that people have to take into account.
Oh yeah, I agree. And listen, I think you and I and others in our field stay up and we worry about this. What's the future? You have a beautiful baby daughter. What's the future for our children, right? And the question has never been more relevant. But that question has also never been more relevant to both Christians and Muslims and atheists and Buddhists. A misconception is that atheists don't have community or don't think about God, but they do. They think about God, they just might not call it God. And then you could say, what's the difference between an agnostic and an atheist? Very little. Human beings question. And a good faith, a good theology starts one way, but it grows and it doesn't look as linear as you might think. And so I wish for rabbinical schools, the major ones, that the deans of admission would ask a couple questions, because I'm not saying that people that question Israel or have pro-Palestinian leanings shouldn't become rabbis, because you can always change their mind with some good Torah learning. But the fact that they have not even come into the Torah learning at all, and they come into rabbinical school, that is frightening to me, that they're not asked these questions. And so we have to say that we really need to change the way that these things, these interviews operate, and who we take in as leaders.
Yeah,
And
I might say, sorry, I was just reflecting on what you said. I might say that if somebody is anti-Zionist, they should not become a rabbi. I mean, I don't think that's too crazy of a thing to say. I think, maybe there's some gray area of connectivity to Israel where, you could sort of see it go either way. But, I also, sort of differentiate. I don't think I've ever talked about this on the podcast, but, I think that there are two modalities of being Jewish in the 21st century. One is legally, in other words, halachically, in terms of, how has Jewish tradition as a religious legal tradition codified Jewish identity. And the second is more, peoplehood, right? This is very much a 20th century conception of Judaism as a people that have a culture and civilization and food and humor and all of that. And I think you need one of the two in order to really be considered not just Jewish, but part of the Jewish community writ large. So if you are, say an Orthodox rabbi and you're
Right.
teaching full Jewish law, and then you say, well, maybe you're part of Satmar, right? Just for listeners' background, Satmar is the largest Hasidic sect in the world, right? I think it's about 500,000 Jews, and there's only about 15 million Jews in the world, right? So about 3 to 4% of every Jew is Satmar, right? Satmar, based on a whole, variety of, you know, teachings from the Talmud, right? They, don't want to really get into it, right? They sort of reject Zionism because they feel that, one, if there is a Jewish state, it should be a, religious Jewish state, and two, God has put us into exile because of our sins, right? This is actually something we say in every prayer service during holidays and, in the Musaf. And so if God hasn't brought us back, okay, fine, it's not actually the time to return to Israel. So if you're a Satmar rabbi, I might not agree with you, but I can respect, where
Oh,
you're
yeah.
coming from. But if you're outside the Orthodox community and your Jewish life doesn't revolve around halacha or Jewish law, then you have to be all in on peoplehood, right? If you
Yeah.
reject, if you're not keeping Jewish law and also at the same time you are rejecting the Jewish peoplehood, right? In other words, Zionism is, a movement really that centers around Jewish peoplehood, right? Jews are a nation and a nation deserves a state. If you reject both of those, I don't really know what's Jewish left. I mean, maybe you can be, Jewish in some sense if your family's Jewish, but like, I don't know. So if you're a non-Orthodox rabbi that rejects Israel, you're basically, I mean, obviously they can still be Jewish if their parents are Jewish, but I don't see any reason to consider that person, Jewish by any real sense of the
Oh,
imagination,
yeah.
other than, just familial.
I agree with you. And I think, sorry, I'm trying, this technology, we always, when COVID hit, I had to think about how do I do technology and how do I move around my apartment to find the right outlets for the right piece of technology. But so I want to go back to what you just said, because I agree with you. I don't think an anti-Zionist should become a progressive rabbi. If they question Israel, if they're a little bit pro-Palestinian, I understand it, because anybody that looks at the seventh and looks at the deaths on in Gaza and doesn't feel badly for human life, is not really somebody that you can speak to. On the other hand, where I would go even further is to say the rabbinical school's job, the university's job, if you're taking a Jewish studies class, is to educate you to say you're a Jew first, and then you're an American, and then you're a university student. But I think that we have gotten away from the self-identification of Jew first, and we've moved more into a universalist space, and that is very troubling, because if you're a universalist, then you're particular about nothing, and if you're a particularist about one thing in your life as a Jew, or as a Christian, or as a Muslim, or as a person of any faith, I would tell you very strongly to be particular about your faith, because faith and a good theology can save and change and elevate a life. And so, again, if you take it back to our beginning of the conversation, everything that a person thinks about at the end of his or her life is really about, did I live a good life? Was I ethical? Was I moral? Was I values based? And if you weren't part of a faith group or a community, then you can't answer that with any real sincerity.
Yeah. I think I agree, and I think oftentimes, especially I could just pick Judaism because I don't have as much of the background to comment on what it's like to practice other religions, but I think a lot of times people think of becoming more involved in Judaism as a restrictive phenomenon, whereas I think it's actually the opposite. I think being tethered to something gives you the raw material to be creative in a way that, if you sit somebody in a room and, there are infinite number of paintbrushes, infinite number of, colors and infinite number of different materials to draw, and you say, draw something nice, maybe they can do one or two pictures, but that, fifth or sixth day, you're just going to lose, you're going to have nothing to bounce your creativity off of versus if you tell them, I don't know, you say, your job is to paint, I don't know, Italy for the next, 2 years. And then you actually go there and you say, try to use these color schemes, even though that seems restrictive, right? All of a sudden you're now not allowed to paint every country in the world. You have to paint this specific place. I think it's actually going to be easier for you to produce things that are creative than if you, give somebody, complete freedom. And I think, also this is, some, I don't know if this is actually a psychological phenomenon, but, I think it is the paradox of freedom where, people don't actually want to be untethered to anything because that actually gives you no bandwidth or raw material to do anything. I know we've been talking for a while. I guess just some, just because I was looking this up before and I read this book. I'm forgetting exactly what it's called, the book on the Harvard Happiness Study. But they came up with some, pretty obvious conclusions. I don't think anybody is going to be surprised by it, but I think, it is just worthwhile to talk about the, couple conclusions. One, obviously focusing on relationships more than any type of materiality or fame, right? Obviously, trying to reduce loneliness as much as possible, viewing happiness as a project and not a end goal, trying to improve your physical and mental health, right? I mean, these things aren't rocket science, but in a sense, we also, just the last thing, and then I, happy to see if there's any final thoughts. We've somehow created, because people are so busy, or at least I think people think that they're busy. I think most people that say they're busy actually aren't that busy. That's my hunch. I think people just waste a lot of time and, whatever. That's a whole separate rant that I'll save for some other time.
No, let's go there. Let's go there actually, because I just
Okay,
went.
so but before I go there, then you can definitely use that as a starting off point. I think this is good because since this podcast is so general and about just general psychology and looking back, it's a good platform for me to give all of my strong opinions that I seldom share on the podcast, but I always share in private social settings. We've created all of these things to make the things in our life that should be the most meaningful things and should be the things that are actually the most beneficial to yourself to work towards. We've tried to streamline it. So, right. And I'm not saying anything about individuals who use this. I'm giving a more generalized argument. I know I'm about to piss some people off, but right, like you look at the prevalence of SSRIs, right? Depression medication. You look at now the rise of Ozempic. You look at now the rise of, I don't know, people trying to create virtual community instead of real community, right? Like all of these things are like, oh, I'll just streamline this so I can focus on the other things that are really worthwhile. And it's like, no. The things, like those are the things that are worthwhile, right? Like you're streamlining all the things that are the most important, right? Making sure that you are physically in shape, making sure that you are, mentally in shape, right? Making sure that you have social interactions, no matter how difficult they are. And instead, people then are freed up for more time for what? For social media, for TV, for, work. So it is a very confusing situation that we're in.
It is. And one of the things that I've always said is a dirty secret is you're only as busy as you make yourself out to be. And if you're so busy that you can't call your grandmother whom you put in a nursing home, or you can't go help your mother or father, even if you're a 30 or 40-year-old adult, move their trash cans in once a week, then you're not busy enough doing the right things. And that makes people upset because then you're calling into question the way they're living their life. But so much of what we began with on the streets of Asheville and Oregon is I have a lot of empathy for people. I do this and you do this as a career because we have empathy for people. But we have to change something, which is the word sympathy and the word empathy. Sympathy is something I don't have for anybody, and I hope I never have for anybody or myself. Empathy, of course. This is a very mentally challenged and deserted moment we're living in, where there is not even a lack of a higher purpose, but just a lack of, there's so much loneliness and isolation that we're seeing, that a lot of these people that are our age on the streets of Oregon and Nashville, they can work, they can get jobs, but they have a lot of mental health challenges that are saying that they cannot. And we have a government, or we've had governments that say, we can't tell you that you shouldn't be homeless. We're gonna help you be homeless, because if that's the way you want to live, then so be it. And I stand up, as should any moral person, to say, no, that's not okay, because that's actually creating the addiction to living that way. And forgetting our tax dollars that shouldn't go to that, we can't create a society where that's all there is. Because if we give people that out, a lot of people today will take it. And so I'm not willing, as a religious leader and as a person of faith, to say that I'm going to give people an out. Now, Ozempic and other drugs that people are taking for depression, the challenge, I think, there is, if you look at the drug side effects, you have 10 to 20 other side effects that even are suicidality and more weight loss and vomiting, nausea, diarrhea, all those side effects.
Yeah, this is an opinion, by the way. I'll clarify, this, because this is not an opinion that gets you loved by anyone. I actually talked to a couple months ago a therapist, and I was sort of giving all my gripes with the therapy industry, which I think is somewhat similar. It's not necessarily against these institutions. I think of therapy and Ozempic and SSRIs the same way I think about antibiotics, right? It's good that they exist, but you should try to do everything you can to not take antibiotics. And the more you actually take antibiotics, it has long-term detrimental effects. In other words, so there are a lot of people, and I have a lot of friends that are in the medical field, and especially psychiatry, and I've had people tell me that, say somebody comes in with X, Y, and Z symptoms, them as the psychiatrist know that if this person just went on a 30-minute hike every day, and touched a tree or something like that, that can actually, fix their mental health problems a lot more even than a lot of SSRIs, but that they know the patient won't do it. So, okay, instead of going back and forth for 3 months and making the patient worse, okay, just prescribe, whatever SSRI. Right. But that's a problem, I think, societally writ large. And I think it does get back to this idea of, having empathy, but also, stressing the personal responsibility that actually, in my mind, shows more respect for somebody, right? Like, if I was a psychiatrist, I'd probably, have a lot of complaints written up against me if I was, for saying things like this. But like, I would imagine if I respected a patient less, they would come in and I'd say, yeah, just take these 3 drugs and whatever, hopefully it works. If I respected someone more, I would sit them down and be like, hey, actually, here's all this research about, everything from changing your diet to exercise to sociability to things that, we're just learning more about, like, I don't know, jumping in a cold lake or something that might work, try this, because if you do try this, there's very little cost to jumping in a cold lake, but you're not going to get yourself hooked on some drug for the rest of your life. So I don't know, just,
Right. As a chaplain, I think that I would end my piece of this podcast, and it's been a joy doing this with you. And I've, again, listened to a lot of what you've said. I'm a very big fan of yours. I think that what you're doing in the college and university setting is incredible. We need more voices like yours, centrist, middle of the road, beautifully diverse voices, but those that lift up instead of bring down. And your Hillel is creating a model for other Hillels to follow around the country, which is that it's about Jewish joy. It's about community at times where we really need it. And now is a time where we need community. And so I would say that I really tell a lot of people that, again, I'm not anti-medication. I know you're not. Your wife, I believe, is becoming a doctor or is a doctor. You're not anti-medication. What we are, though, is we're saying Torah is a great prescription. Faith is a great prescription that, just like medication, can heal, save, and elevate lives. And when I'm in a room with people and, we're talking about why chaplaincy, hospice chaplaincy, prison chaplaincy is relevant, because across the country, they're taking these programs out. They are defunding them. They are not funding these positions anymore the way they should be or used to be. I've always said spirituality is just as important as physical medicine is. And in some cases, it does more good than the physical medicine, because a person can go to a doctor all of their life and get addicted to that doctor or that prescription, when if they just sat at a Shabbos table, if they just sat around a community dinner, they could understand that there's so much more than just that medication, that self-numbing. And sometimes we have to, again, live in the gray. Everything is not binary. To use LA terms, this is non-binary. Much of life, 95% of life is non-binary, and 80% of the conversations we're having are really great. And the 20% that we need to change, and the 5% that is binary, that's where we need to discuss. And it's different for everybody. What's binary and fluid for me is not the same for you. And the question becomes, can we sit in community together? Can we speak to people we don't agree with? And can we really understand how to live proactively, so that when we reach our end, and we never know when that is, when we do, can we look back and we say we lived the best life that we could?
Yeah, I think just as a good prescription for people, I try to do this. I don't know if I always do it, but I think it is good advice nonetheless, is whenever you're about to do something, think about, if you had done that 5 years ago, how would you look back on the memory of having done that thing? And oftentimes that's going to come up with a very different answer than what you do right now, for better and worse. I mean, I think it could stop you from doing some pretty bad things, and it can force you to get out of your comfort zone and do some pretty good things. Anyway, Jonah, thank you so much for the conversation.
Yes.